Today we're reviewing the Asus ROG Strix XG32UQWMS, the first 32-inch sized tandem WOLED monitor that we've tested, following on from the 27-inch models that we've seen released over the last year or so, but this time with a larger screen size and a 4K resolution on offer. The updated Tandem WOLED panel promises a brighter panel, improved colours and improved contrast, along with expected lifespan and durability improvements compared with the earlier gen WOLED panels of this segment. And so we know a lot of you have been excited to see this latest gen make its way finally into the 32-inch segment. The new XG32UQWMS follows on from Asus's XG32UQWMG model released and reviewed last year, and our long-standing top recommendation for a 32-inch 4K OLED monitor, with just a couple of the letters of the model changing for this new version this year. The C in the old name represents the inclusion of USB-C connectivity, which is not included on this new model. The Q represents instead DisplayPort, which of course is also included on the old model too. The G in the name from last year's model also represents the inclusion of Aura Sync RGB lighting on the back, while the S on the new model represents no Aura Sync. Simple-ish, but there are more upgrades and changes with the underlying panel here as well, and some differences between the two in feature set. In case you were interested in the mysterious naming conventions and the other letters and numbers, they're not random, they do represent the following details in the Asus monitor lineup. Anyway, let's cover the things that remain the same first of all. It's still a 32-inch size screen with a 3840 by 2160 4K resolution, a native 240Hz refresh rate, and a dual mode function that supports 480Hz at a lower 1080p resolution. It's got the same simpler ROG Strix series design, which we know a lot of people really like, apart from the Aura Sync lighting that we've already mentioned that's on the back of the screen on the old model, but not included here. It's got the same stand with tilt, height and swivel adjustments, and the same true black glossy screen coating, which gives a super sharp and clear image that fans of glossy coatings will continue to love. It's still got an eLNB blur reduction mode for gaming, variable refresh rate support, OLED anti-flicker modes, and Asus's extensive range of settings and extras which characterise the ROG series of monitors. Some things are different though, and it's not just with the underlying WOLED panel which has received the update here to the latest tandem WOLED technology. We'll talk about the panel a bit more in a moment. Throughout this review, we'll compare the old model and the new model, and we'll try and use consistent colour coding for each, so orange for the old model and blue for the new model. Connectivity options are actually more limited on the new model, with the removal of the USB Type-C connection and one of the USB-A data ports that the old model offers. It's still got one DisplayPort 1.4, two HDMI 2.1 connections and two USB-A data ports, along with a headphone connection as well. So it's likely to be fine for most users anyway, but it is more limited if you wanted to connect a laptop to the screen. The removal of the USB Type-C connection also means there's no KVM switch function on this new model, unfortunately, but it does still retain picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture modes for handling multiple video inputs still. It's got the same comprehensive range of OLED Care features, although we did note that there was no longer an option to fully disable the pixel shift function on the screen. There's only controls now for its frequency, and that seems to be carrying through to other new Asus monitors as well. Asus have also included their Neo proximity sensor for turning the screen off when you move away from it to help reduce the risks of image retention. And also they've added a couple of additional customization options to the new version, which are quite handy. The on-screen menu and options are largely the same, although the new model includes an additional quick launch menu pop-up too. Asus has switched to an internal power supply instead of the external brick which came with the previous model, and this is also a new GaN power supply on this new version as well, which promises better heat dissipation than their standard internal power supplies that they've used on some of their past other screens, while also achieving higher power efficiency too. The result, according to Asus, is nearly 35% less waste heat and 10% cooler vent temperatures compared to their previous internal power supplies that they've used on some of their other models in the past. And this can help contribute to longer OLED lifespan with zero compromises on performance. The Tandem WOLED panel is also promoted by LG Display as offering improved lifespan and durability, and Asus say that it should offer 60% longer lifespan actually, although that's very hard to validate of course. They continue to feature their fanless custom heatsink design for cooling and offer a 3-year warranty including burning cover. One other new feature is what Asus are calling Smart Pixel, an upscaling feature that is designed to sharpen and improve image detail for lower resolution content. We'll check that out a little bit later on. The key upgrade though is to the panel itself. This is one of the first screens to be released to market in the 32-inch segment to use the latest Tandem WOLED panel technology from LG Display. We've seen this in many 27-inch monitors already, including some very good options from Asus themselves, but this marks a shift in the 32-inch segment, which a lot of people have been holding out for. Anyway, let's get on to some of the relevant testing, and let's start with SDR brightness. In the monitor's uniform brightness configuration, which keeps a consistent brightness regardless of your content for desktop apps and general usage, the screen can reach 326 nits maximum, and if you disable the uniform brightness mode, you can push up to 516 nits peak, but you'll have to live with some ABL dimming as the content changes on the screen. That mode could be useful for dynamic SDR content and gaming if you feel like you need a further boost in brightness, but 326 nits in the uniform mode is already very good for an OLED screen. The other 27-inch Tandem WOLED panels that we've tested previously can reach a little higher in some cases, but the key thing here is that this new screen offers a 27% higher luminance than the earlier 32-inch 4K WOLED model thanks to the upgraded Tandem WOLED panel. That's a decent improvement in SDR luminance capability. Following the principles of Samsung Display's True Bright certification, this maximum luminance would be perceptually equivalent to a traditional LCD with around 540 nits luminance. At the lower end, there's a super low adjustment range as well, all the way down to 8 nits in fact, which makes the screen very suitable for usage even in the darkest rooms. And that's a lower luminance than the 32 nits of the previous model. The Tandem WOLED panel upgrade also offers improved colours in both SDR and HDR. We measured the colour gamut of the screen and compared it with the previous gen model. The colour space of the new panel extends even further beyond the sRGB reference, reaching 150% relative coverage with a wider range of red and blue shades especially. On paper, the DCI-P3 spec was already 99% on the old model, and at first glance, it might not seem like a big upgrade when you see the new spec of 99.5% on the new model, but actually, the colour space extends quite a bit further now, and we had 119% coverage of DCI-P3 on the new panel compared with 102% on the old panel. This leads to improvements in the Rec 2020 colour gamut coverage as well, up from 74% on the old model to 84% here, which is a result of these changes. And you have a potentially more vivid, colourful and saturated image as a result. You can also see the improved separation in the spectral distribution on the new Tandem WOLED panel thanks to the new 4-stack structure, which is related to those colour space improvements. Not everyone will want those more vivid colours for SDR content, we should keep in mind, and Asus continue to offer a useful sRGB emulation mode clamp for more accurate matching in the sRGB colour space. But if you like that more saturated and colourful image, maybe for gaming and multimedia perhaps, this new panel gives you a further boost. The bigger benefit of this wider colour space is when you want to view content that is mastered in the wider colour spaces, such as some HDR content for instance, which could be mastered in Rec 2020. In HDR content and side-by-side comparisons, you get more vivid and colourful images here too on this new panel, giving you a more impressive and colourful experience for HDR. We can also examine colours further in HDR mode, where we need to take a look beyond just the standard 2D chromaticity measurements and the typical CEI colour space diagrams that we've already shown. And one way to do this is to consider colour volume and perceived colour brightness in different scenes. In HDR, the colour performance across the whole range of luminance is very important, and the range of reproducible colours at different luminance levels needs to be considered. This is where the concept of colour volume comes from. Basically, the higher the volume, the better. We've explored this topic at length in the past, and without making it super complicated here, we should say that on a WOLED technology panel where a white subpixel has been added to the panel design alongside the usual red, green and blue subpixels, this is used to help increase overall panel brightness, but it can impact the saturation of colours, their vividness and ultimately the colour volume. To put it simply, in dark overall scenes with a low APL, where the screen pushes up to the maximum overall brightness levels, the white subpixel comes into play more. And while that helps to reach the peak brightness capabilities, this can cause some washout of colours and lead to what is commonly referred to as volumetric collapse. In brighter overall scenes with a higher APL, you don't need the white subpixel as much, or sometimes maybe not at all, and the red, green and blue subpixels can reach the high enough luminance on their own, and colour volume in those instances is therefore better. In practice, what this usually results in is bright colour highlights in mostly darker scenes end up looking less colourful and saturated and often less bright than on competing technologies such as QD-OLED panels. In their instance, they don't have the white subpixel, it's not used at all. So think about things like red brake lights on a car at night, fireworks on a night sky, maybe neon lights in a dark city scenes, for example. LG Display have more recently started to explore true RGB stripe panels without the added white subpixel as well, which should help performance in this area, but that's a topic for another day. We'll be reviewing Asus's new PG32UQWM with a 32-inch 4K Tandem WOLED panel and RGB stripe design soon as well. Anyway, the reason for talking about this is that the new Tandem WOLED panel promises improvements in colour luminance and colour volume. And Asus advertise actually a 25% improvement in colour volume on their product page as well. Having spoken to Asus, we confirm that this stat is relative to a previous Gen WOLED panel, one that's used in their XG32UQWMS Gen 2, which is another screen that we reviewed quite recently as well. The challenge with colour volume measurements though is that there's no agreed industry standard approach for this at this time, with varying competing philosophies and testing approaches, and ongoing debate about how this should be defined. We confirmed with the Asus that the 25% larger colour volume spec comes from LG Display, and it's based on a specific colour volume framework defined by Dolby. We'll explain that a little bit more in a moment too. We'll use that approach to measure the improvements ourselves alongside another commonly recommended approach to give a more complete evaluation, using a new data presentation approach called gamut rings. Anyway, enough preamble. We measured the colour volume of both the old and the new model in a couple of different scenes and scenarios. One in dark scenes with a 1.5% APL and the other in bright scenes with a 25% APL. First up, let's compare the measurements using the Dolby framework that LG Display used. This uses a metric of millions of distinguishable colours, or MDC for short, to describe the range of both colours and luminance levels that a display can reproduce. This is based on the ICTCP colour volume model and is measured relative to a peak luminance target of 10,000 nits, and using the Rec 2020 colour space too. Basically, at the end of the measurements you get a single number which can then be used to compare between different screens. We measured a 21 to 27% improvement in MDC depending on the scene APL, aligning broadly with the LG Display's quoted improvements for the Tandem WOLED panel. In addition to this, we've also used an alternative commonly accepted approach, which is CIE Lab, where colours are measured relative to the peak white luminance of the screen itself, along with a more recently introduced presentation approach called gamut rings. This helps present the data in a more visually useful and meaningful way for interpretation and comparison using a 2D diagram. This gets around challenges with the previous 3D diagram presentation very nicely, and it does at least make presentation and comparisons a lot simpler. Shout out to Masaoka-san for the creation and development of gamut rings. In terms of interpreting the gamut rings, and again keeping this as simple as possible, the more coloured in the rings are and the less grey areas there are, the higher the colour volume is. We can then view these gamut rings relative to the different colour spaces when the data is measured, but we've provided them here relative to Rec 2020 again. And we'll list the peak white luminance measurements too, along with the calculations, as they're also useful to understand. The diagrams can be compared along with the volume percentage calculations shown next to each. In dark, low APL scenes, the colour volume has improved with the shift to a tandem WOLED panel from 31% coverage of Rec 2020 to 35%, a relative improvement of 13% compared with the old panel. In brighter, high APL scenes, the colour volume has increased from 47% Rec 2020 to 64%, a relative improvement of 36%. The new Tandem WOLED panel is capable of offering higher colour luminance across a wider range of colours, which in turn improves the colour volume measurements quite nicely. This results in a somewhat more colourful and vivid image in HDR content, which is evident in side-by-side comparisons. The change isn't huge, but it is noticeable. We need to be a little bit careful about considering colour volume in isolation. If you compare these measurements to a QD-OLED panel, for instance, you can see just how much better QD-OLED is in these measurements alone. And that's because of its additive approach, using only RGB subpixels and not including a white subpixel. However, this QD-OLED panel reaches 1000 nits peak brightness only, while the Tandem WOLED panel reaches 1500 nits. And in practice, there isn't such a drastic difference, with the WOLED panel actually looking a fair bit brighter as well. It's more useful to use colour volume to compare the old and the new WOLED panels, which have the same design and same subpixel structure, but it gets more complicated and confusing when you start to compare it with QD-OLED. We should also consider HDR brightness and colour brightness further. The new Tandem WOLED panel also brings about improvements in HDR brightness, with this new monitor being certified under the VESA Display HDR True Black 500 tier, a step up in brightness requirements compared with the True Black 400 tier used for the earlier model. This new screen offers a familiar range of HDR modes, including an adjustable HDR setting, which allows you to push the brightness up to its full maximum potential. We'll start by looking at peak white luminance measurements, but keep in mind that these don't tell the full story when it comes to real-world HDR brightness. We maxed out the brightness setting to 100 for all of these modes, and the gaming, cinema and console modes all behave the same really and reach close to the advertised 1500 nits peak white, while the True Black 500 mode reaches 770 max if you run at the maximum brightness setting. If we compare these peak brightness measurements with the earlier gen model, you can see some modest improvements in most scenes, with a 16% higher peak white luminance and up to 26% higher white luminance for full screen white. That full screen white measurement is what puts it over the True Black 500 certification spec as well. As we said earlier, these figures alone can't tell you everything about screen brightness. We need to carry out more thorough testing. If we consider the EOTF tracking between the two models, you can see pretty similar performance overall, with over-brightening of mid to light grey shades in darker scenes, and then more accurate luminance in brighter overall scenes. This over-brightening in the darker scenes makes the overall HDR experience brighter, but can crush some lighter details in some situations, although it's not too severe here. In side-by-side comparisons, both screens looked very similar to one another really in overall brightness, and it was hard to pick out any major differences in that regard. Our real scene brightness measurements support that as well, showing only around a 4% higher luminance in most of the scenes, although in one bright scene, the old model actually had a marginally higher luminance. We also measured the average grayscale luminance of each screen, a more thorough and complete approach than just the white luminance measurements earlier. This too showed an average 4% improvement in luminance with the new panel in darker scenes, although in brighter scenes it can reach up to around 17% improvement in luminance. It's the brighter overall scenes which start to show a little bit more improvement. While both screens look generally equally bright in real-world HDR content in side-by-side comparisons, a more noticeable difference is the colours on the new Tandem WOLED panel, which offer a moderate improvement. It's not massive, but colours do look more vivid and saturated in many situations, making the image look overall more colourful. That's largely a result of the improved colour gamma and the colour volume that we discussed earlier. To go along with these earlier measurements, we can also calculate an XCR score for each screen in a variety of different scenes, which takes into account the colour luminance capabilities of the panel and the perceived brightness impact that a wider colour gamut has visually. This is a topic that we've explored in detail in the past, so if you want to know loads more about it, then do check out our other article link below. In simple terms, these XCR scores provide a better way to compare the perceived brightness of an image than purely relying on just luminance measurements alone. The new Tandem WOLED panel in the updated model offers a 9% improvement in perceived brightness for colours compared with the earlier gen model, which is good, and we observed improved colours in many scenes side by side as we said. So to summarise, HDR EOTF tracking and overall brightness was generally pretty similar to the earlier gen WOLED model, although keep in mind that already performed very well. There were some minor brightness improvements in most scenes with the new Tandem WOLED panel, and a little bit more improvement in the brighter overall scenes. More noticeable were the improvements in colour brightness and colour volume thanks to the new panel, which translated to a more colourful HDR experience overall. One additional benefit of the new Tandem WOLED panel is also the improved black depth and contrast and the panel's ambient light handling. The combination of the true black glossy panel coating and the new 4th gen Tandem WOLED panel offer the best black depth performance that we've seen so far, even in brighter room conditions. There's moderate improvements compared with the earlier gen model and significant benefits compared with a QD-OLED panel, even those that now feature the improved quantum black coating, which has made some improvements in that area for sure, but still lags behind the best WOLED panels. This leads to a higher contrast and deeper blacks for HDR, even in more well-lit room environments. We're not going to spend ages covering gaming capabilities, as these are largely the same as the previous XG32UQWMS model. So if you want to know loads more about response times, motion clarity, ELMB mode performance, and so on, then check out our review for that screen that's linked below. At its native 240Hz refresh rate, the screen offers the exact same excellent motion clarity as other 240Hz OLED monitors. Asus do also provide a dual mode function, which allows you to double your refresh rate to 480Hz when dropping to 1080p resolution, which improves motion clarity and other gaming performance metrics nicely. But it comes at the cost, of course, of resolution. You have to drop down to 1080p, which doesn't look great on a 32-inch size screen, but it's probably okay for a lot of faster, lower resolution game situations if you need it, or perhaps if you want to use one of the smaller screen emulation modes. We prefer more modern dual mode options like the 27-inch 5K monitors, which run at a more reasonable and sensible 1440p in dual mode. The drop from 4K to 1080p on a large 32-inch screen is quite drastic. When using dual mode, you get not only improvements in motion clarity, but also improvements in frame rates, reduced stroboscopic effect, and improved system latency, all of which we talked more about in our review of the previous model. If you consider faster gaming scroll speeds, then this is where you start to see the differences between 240Hz and the higher refresh rate options more clearly. And so there are certainly benefits from competitive gaming situations using the 480Hz dual mode. Variable refresh rates are supported via adaptive sync, and Asus provide their familiar OLED anti-flicker modes in the menu as well. In normal mode, the VRR flicker was high in dark scenes, but very low in other situations, which was good. Being a WOLED panel, the flicker is caused by the variable gamma, which changes as refresh rates change. So the trick with a WOLED panel is to try and keep frame rates as consistent as possible, regardless of what that frame rate actually is that you achieve. If you enabled anti-flicker on the middle setting, it shortens the VRR range a bit from 48Hz minimum to 123Hz minimum. This reduces the potential max severity of the flicker a little bit for the large frame rate swings, but not by much. Flicker is still noticeable in darker situations where frame rate swings occur. Using the high anti-flicker mode reduces the flicker quite significantly, but this is largely because VRR is being disabled altogether for a big portion of the refresh rate range in the middle. In dual mode operation, there is a much wider VRR range at play, and so the gamma varies more significantly with the anti-flicker setting disabled, being very pronounced in darker scenes, leading to more potential flicker. Again, it depends how variable your frame rate really is. These are the most extreme test scenarios, and it won't be as bad if your frame rate is more consistent. The middle anti-flicker setting reduces the total VRR range quite a lot, but still leaves you with a wide active range for gaming, and actually does a really good job of eliminating a lot of the darker scene flickering we found. However, for situations where you might cross the various boundaries, like to the LFC area, produce more visible flicker. So that should be avoided where possible, but we think the middle setting works very nicely in dual mode. The high setting in dual mode caps the maximum refresh rate to 400Hz instead of 480Hz, but the overall performance seems to be very similar to the middle mode in terms of flicker. Asus provide a black frame insertion mode like on their other modern ROG OLED monitors, which is available at half your normal refresh rate. Operation and availability is the same as the earlier XG32 model, so we won't repeat that here. Check out our full review if you want to know more about that. The key things are that it operates at a fixed refresh rate only, at half your native refresh rate, and it's available in both normal 4K mode and 1080p dual mode. eLMB improves motion clarity to the equivalent of double its active settings. So, for instance, at 120Hz with eLMB, you get the same motion clarity as normal 240Hz mode, but you now only need to power frame rates up to 120 FPS to get that motion clarity. This is great for systems which struggle to power 4K 240Hz fully, and for older game titles and external devices which might run at 120Hz max, like modern games consoles for instance. Likewise, in dual mode, if you can only push up to around 240 FPS at 1080p, eLMB mode can give you a really nice bump in motion clarity to 480Hz like levels. At the time of testing, there was a firmware bug which meant that we couldn't actually enable eLMB while using dual mode, but Asus have confirmed that they've replicated the issue and it will be addressed in a future firmware update soon. Importantly, eLMB mode has its own independent brightness control memory as well, so you don't need to change it each time you turn it off and on. The new Tandem WOLED panel offers a decent improvement in maximum brightness capabilities as well, compared with the earlier gen model. That's useful for those who might like to push brightness to higher levels for gaming when using this setting. There's a really comprehensive range of gaming extras, settings and features on the screen, like on the other Asus ROG series monitors. Notably, Asus have added a new Smart Pixel feature, which offers 4K upscaling for lower resolution devices, games and inputs. This has got 3 levels available in the menu, and it seems to apply a sharpening filter to the image, working quite nicely actually for low resolution modes and inputs, and it sharpens up the image quite well. This also works in 1080p dual mode operation and for external consoles and other devices as well, and it provides some nice visual improvements we thought. There's a couple of screen size scaling modes in the menu which can simulate a 24.5 inch or 27 inch size screen. Those operate with 1:1 pixel mapping when using the native mode, so that fills the space accurately, and so the new resolutions are shown here for each. But you can also, of course, lower your resolution to something like 1080p for more typical resolutions for something like a 24.5 inch size if you want to. These can also be used in dual mode, giving you access to the 480Hz refresh rate with a smaller screen size. Console support was excellent overall, with 4K 120Hz support, VRR and strong HDR capabilities thanks to the OLED panel. You can use the eLMB blur reduction mode at 120Hz if you want, which is useful for improving motion clarity. Note that there's no speakers on this model like on other Asus monitors, and no Dolby Vision HDR support, which is featured on some of their other models. Input lag was super low at the native 240Hz refresh rate, in the dual mode 480Hz mode, and when using VRR. Basically nothing at all, and it was only marginally higher actually for 60Hz input devices, but still very low. These results were identical to the previous XG32 model. Lag also seemed to be consistent when using the 24.5 inch and 27 inch scaling modes, which was good news. We couldn't seem to get our lag testing setup working for 120Hz eLMB measurements annoyingly, but we'd expect a few milliseconds of lag penalty when using eLMB mode like on other Asus OLEDs that we've tested. SDR performance was very good overall, as you'd expect from Asus's OLED range. The screen comes out of the box in the racing preset mode with its full native colour space in play. Grayscale accuracy and RGB balance were very good, although gamma varied a little bit in this mode we found. With the wide native gamma active, accuracy for sRGB content was poor, as you'd expect from any wide gamut screen. It was better for DCI-P3 content with a closer match of colour spaces, but Asus provide 2 options for sRGB emulation which are useful and allow more accurate working for SDR content. You can simply switch the color space setting in the menu to sRGB, retaining full access then to all of the other settings and giving you great flexibility if you need to adjust things like gamma, colors and so on. The gamma improved in this mode actually, although the grayscale was slightly warmer now. But importantly, there was solid clamping of the color space back to sRGB, offering very good color accuracy now. There's also a factory calibrated sRGB Cal preset mode, which offered a very accurate overall setup, with great grayscale and gamma accuracy, along with good color space clamping and sRGB color accuracy. This wasn't quite as accurate as the other approach, and you do lose access to most of the on-screen settings, so using the first method is probably optimal for sRGB emulation. There's also a DCI-P3 color space setting, which behaves very similarly to the sRGB setting, but this time the color space is clamped back to DCI-P3 with very good color accuracy. That's potentially useful for some users who are working with HDR content perhaps. We'll link below to our best settings guide and calibrated ICC profile if you want to check those out as well and buy this screen. We measured the shadow detail in SDR mode as well and found that the screen behaves in the same way as other WOLED panels that we've tested, and it's something that we explored in depth in our dedicated article on the topic. The gamma on WOLED screens is variable depending on the refresh rate, and the normal approach then is for the factory calibration and configuration to be carried out at 60 Hz. The problem with that then is that the gamma then shifts a bit for higher refresh rates, or also varies during VRR situations, and this causes changes in the visible shadow detail in darker content normally. In the native wide gamut mode, configured to a 2.2 gamma, the shadow detail was very good at 60 Hz, with the first visible grey shade being RGB2, but at 240 Hz there's more black crush and you lose sight of the darkest shades unfortunately. It's a similar story in the sRGB Cal preset mode, which is configured to the slightly different sRGB gamma instead of 2.2. Shadow detail was excellent at 60 Hz, but only moderate at 240 Hz because of the gamma shift. This is an issue on all WOLED panels at the moment, and it's unavoidable unfortunately. But QD-OLED panels do not suffer from this variable gamma in the same way, so if the factory calibration is good, they can offer more reliable and consistent performance. Asus provide a shadow boost setting in SDR which can tweak darker content a little bit. There's levels of 1, 2, 3 and a dynamic mode in the menu. Level 1 makes very little difference at all, while levels 2 and 3 make a minor improvement, raising the dark detail luminance slightly. The dynamic mode makes a drastic difference to the luminance of the darker scenes, raising brightness quite considerably, and all of the modes thankfully work without raising the black point, which is great news. Shadow detail was very variable in HDR mode. It was excellent at 60 Hz where the factory calibration is applied and we could see grayscale RGB1. However, at higher refresh rates like 240 Hz, we had pretty noticeable black crush on our unit. And that's due, like we say, to the variable gamma that impacts WOLED panels. The first visible grayscale shade was now RGB9. This could vary between samples potentially, but optimal HDR shadow detail performance is in the lower refresh rates, and it could perhaps be an issue at higher refresh rates. For general and office use, we talked about the size, resolution, panel coating, pixel layout, scaling options, and burn-in considerations in detail in our review of the earlier XG32 model. So we won't repeat all of that here. Just check out that other review if you want to know more about our analysis. We'll just say that 4K resolution and the 140 ppi pixel density offers an excellent picture quality. The brighter panel capabilities make the screen more suitable for even brighter room conditions and for those who like a brighter display generally, although keep in mind that the glossy screen coating may cause challenges with reflections and glare compared to a matte anti-glare coating. For those who are familiar with the grey banding uniformity issues on OLED panels, the new Tandem WOLED panel seemed to show a little bit more visible banding in very dark shades, compared with the earlier gen panel. It's a familiar pattern that we've explored in detail in the past, and this issue seems to be a little bit worse on the Tandem panel. It was not too bad though here on our sample we thought, and certainly not something that we saw during normal day-to-day usage outside of dark mode applications. Results may vary of course between samples, and this might be a little bit more of a concern on Tandem WOLED compared with earlier gen WOLED for some people. As with other WOLED panels, this banding also varies with the refresh rate, and it's better at lower refresh rates than higher. So in dual mode, it's more noticeable and there's more of a dirty screen effect visible too. Feature-wise, Asus have removed the USB Type-C and KVM switch functions that were included on the older model, which is a bit of a shame, and there's a more modest set of extras on offer here. There's a decent adjustable stand with a smaller footprint and simpler design than their ROG Swift series, which a lot of people prefer, and the screen can also be easily controlled and adjusted quickly using the joystick toggle on the back of the screen or using Asus's handy display widget center software, which we've explored in detail in a previous article. To summarize, the XG32UQWMS offers some nice upgrades to an already excellent 32-inch 4K OLED monitor panel, actually bumping the old version off the top spot of our recommendations for this segment. The Tandem WOLED panel offers some decent improvements to brightness, mostly for SDR content and normal usage to be honest, but this also translates into gaming and the ELMB blur reduction mode too. In HDR, there are some minor improvements in overall brightness in some situations, but not huge amounts compared with the previous version, which already performed very well in this area. What is more noticeable though are the improvements in the colour brightness and colour vividness in HDR content thanks to the new Tandem WOLED panel upgrade. That's a more noticeable difference in practice we thought, along with the improved contrast in brighter rooms. There are a couple of downgrades though of note here, like the removal of the USB Type-C connection and the KVM switch, which some people may miss, and it's sad to see that those have been omitted on the new model. If you especially need either of those, the previous XG32 model is still an excellent screen and could well come down in price as well with this new version being released. We've also now received the Asus ROG Swift PG32UQWM for review, which is their alternative 32-inch 4K Tandem WOLED display in the higher ROG Swift lineup, featuring a slightly different panel with an RGB striped subpixel layout and offering some different specs and features too. And we'll try and compare that with this new XG32 model and various other 32-inch models in that review. That's a flagship model which we're really looking forward to testing out soon. The XG32UQWMS should be available very soon, although availability as always will vary by region. We've not been given a confirmed price yet unfortunately, so it's a little bit hard to comment on where it sits value-wise compared with the earlier model and competing options. This would be our new top pick in the 32-inch OLED segment, and we think the upgrades from the old model are nice, not worth replacing if you've got the old model, but worth paying a little bit more for if you're after a new screen, as long as the price difference isn't too drastic when it's released. Do let us know in the comment section below if you've got your eye on any of these new 32-inch OLED monitors, or perhaps something different this year. We'd love to hear what your plans are. Thank you for watching, we'll catch you next time.